It was just past 7:30 p.m. when the officers' club lit up with noise, brass, and the overly confident laughter of men in neatly pressed uniforms. The heat of the Arizona desert still clung to the edges of the building, but inside, the air was cool and thick with celebration. A new crop of lieutenants had just received their bars, and they moved through the crowd like they owned the place. Glasses clinked. Jokes flew too fast. The kind of bravado only found in freshly minted officers was everywhere. Second Lieutenant Brandon Keene stood at the center of it all. Uniform, crisp. Posture perfect. Ego even sharper. He had graduated top third from the academy, and he hadn't let anyone forget it. His voice was just loud enough to carry. The kind of tone that needed an audience. Every smile he gave was half smirk. He hadn't earned anything in battle, but he wore his new rank-like armor. Near the back of the room, unnoticed by most, stood a woman in a faded green flight suit. Her boots were scuffed. The knees of her pants stretched with use. Her name tag was barely legible. She held a glass of water with a stillness that somehow made the whole party seem too loud. She wasn't mingling. She wasn't smiling. She was simply there, as if observing a room she didn't quite belong to. Her hair was short, flecked with gray. Her posture, though relaxed, held a kind of subtle readiness. Something about her presence whispered history. Keene noticed her, and something in him twisted. He nudged the lieutenant next to him and tilted his head toward her. Then he stepped forward with that easy swagger only 20-something men with too much confidence and too little experience seemed to perfect. He raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear. He asked if she was there to fix the coffee machine or maybe recalibrate the vending machine in the hallway. The joke landed with a forced, uncomfortable chuckle from a few of the nearby officers. Most turned away or stared at their drinks. The woman didn't blink. She didn't smile or shift her weight. She just took another sip of water, eyes fixed somewhere far beyond the room. Colonel Marcus Thorne stood on the upper level, watching from the balcony. He had been in the service longer than most of these kids had been alive. His eyes narrowed. He recognized the stance, the way she balanced her feet, the calm in her shoulders. It wasn't passivity. It was control. Measured. Deliberate. Familiar. He had seen that posture before. In combat zones and cockpits. Right before things went very right or very wrong. Keene waited for a reaction that never came. And in that silence, something shifted. You couldn't name it. You couldn't point at it. But the air had changed. The woman remained still. The party stumbled forward. But for some reason, nothing felt quite the same after that. The alarm hit without warning. At exactly 8:02 p.m., the shrill wail of the base-wide emergency system cut through the music and conversation like a blade. Red strobes lit up the officers' club in pulses of panic. Laughter died instantly. Glasses froze mid-air. Conversations stopped mid-word. In the span of a breath, the mood shifted from celebration to crisis. It wasn't a drill. Everyone knew it by the tone of the siren. It was lower, meaner, urgent, in a way that drills never were. That particular frequency had only one meaning. Something expensive and dangerous was failing. The room erupted into a controlled kind of chaos. Junior officers reached for radios they barely knew how to use. Phones lit up across the crowd. Someone turned off the music. A voice came through the intercom, flat and shaking, announcing an in-flight systems failure on an inbound X-7 Spectre. A hush fell over the room at the name. The X-7 wasn't just another drone. It was a long-range reconnaissance platform, top secret, experimental, and packed with tech nobody talked about outside of secure briefings. The voice continued. Full control failure. Propulsion still active. Payload classified. Fuel tanks full. Trajectory unstable. Impact zone projected near the outskirts of Haven Rock. A monitor on the wall flickered, switching from a slideshow of promotion photos to a stream of live telemetry. The drone's path was shown in red, a downward arc, the kind of arc that doesn't curve up again. Second Lieutenant Keene stepped forward, voice louder than needed, barking questions at no one in particular. He asked for a sitrep. He demanded updates. He spoke with authority he didn't have, hoping volume would cover confusion. His face flushed as he tried to impose structure on a situation spinning faster than he could process. Behind him, the woman in the worn flight suit moved, calmly, quietly. Without waiting for orders or looking around for permission, she walked with purpose toward a narrow alcove at the side of the room. It held an auxiliary communications console, mostly used for coordinating VIP transport. She sat down and began typing. Keene saw her. His voice jumped half an octave. He demanded she stop, asked what she thought she was doing, called her out as unauthorized. She didn't answer. She didn't even look up. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with a speed and confidence that startled the officers nearby. The screen in front of her lit up. Layers of drone diagnostics, subsystem maps, and raw flight code unfolded, like pages in a book only she could read. She wasn't navigating menus. She was diving deep. Manual overrides, access keys, emergency control channels not found in standard protocols. The others stood frozen, watching. A few muttered. One lieutenant said she was going to make it worse. Another whispered something about comms techs overstepping, but nobody moved to stop her. There was something in the way she worked, a stillness inside the storm. The red arc on the big screen was still falling. But now, somewhere in that room, someone had started fighting back, quietly, from a corner console, without permission, without panic. At first, the red arc on the telemetry screen stayed exactly where it had been. Still diving, still headed straight for Haven Rock. People stared, holding their breath without knowing they were doing it. And then Colonel Thorne leaned forward. It was so subtle, most didn't notice. A single degree. Maybe less. But the line was no longer falling straight down. It had started to bend, just slightly, just enough. Someone whispered. Another officer pointed. The shift wasn't a glitch. The trajectory was changing. All eyes moved from the big screen to the corner of the room, where the woman in the flight suit sat behind the auxiliary console. Her back was straight. Her fingers were a blur. She wasn't reacting to the chaos behind her. She wasn't asking for guidance. She was working with the kind of focus that came from deep, total understanding. The drone wasn't responding to standard inputs. Its flight controls were gone. Its primary systems were dead, but she hadn't gone through the front door. She'd gone underneath it, through subroutines, maintenance channels, lines of raw code no one in that room even knew existed. Fuel transfer systems lit up on her display. She was shifting weight between the drone's wing tanks, carefully redistributing mass. Seconds later, the attitude thrusters fired. Tiny controlled bursts of compressed nitrogen, meant for high-altitude adjustment, not meant for flying. But somehow, she was using them to steer. Lieutenant Keene stood still now. His mouth was open, hands slightly raised, like he'd forgotten what he meant to say. One of the other lieutenants leaned in and whispered that this wasn't possible. Nobody could fly a dead drone, especially not like that, especially not without touching a stick or calling the tower. She hadn't touched comms. She hadn't said a word, but the telemetry kept changing. Then someone noticed the access line she'd used at login, an override string labeled Sigma 7 Echo Charlie. It wasn't just a technician's access code, it was a top-tier engineering backdoor. The kind of master key that never made it outside of program-level development. Someone asked how she even had it. Thorne didn't answer. He just watched. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't celebrate the tiny change in course. She knew it wasn't enough yet. But it was movement, control, influence, and that meant time. Keene finally found his voice. But it was small now. He asked who she was. Nobody responded. The telemetry continued to shift. The red arc was no longer a straight dive. It was gliding now, uneven, struggling, but moving sideways, away from homes and schools and lives. She wasn't flying the drone, she was speaking to it. Not like a pilot, not even like a technician. She was speaking like someone who knew it from the inside out, who had written the systems herself, who had built it. And that's when the first realization sank in. She didn't just know the drone, she was its creator. The X-7 Spectre didn't explode. It didn't scatter into flame or smoke. It hit the marsh just outside the base perimeter with a deep, heavy thud. The kind of sound that stays in your chest. The drone was down, intact. The town of Haven Rock, just over the ridge. Never even knew how close it had come. Inside the officers' club, the silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. All eyes were still on the big screen, where the telemetry line had finally ended in a green circle marked E-Zone, Safe Zone. A miracle. Colonel Marcus Thorne broke the silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He turned to the aide by the wall and spoke clearly. Pull up the full personnel file for the technician at the auxiliary station. All of it. Unredacted. His voice left no room for hesitation. The screen flickered. Then changed. Her name appeared first. Chief Warrant Officer, 5 Evelyn M. Ross. The room shifted. Slowly. Like it was sinking into something it hadn't prepared for. CW5. The highest possible technical rank in the U.S. military. Some officers served their whole careers without ever meeting one. They weren't common. They weren't ordinary. They were rare and respected and, most of the time, invisible. The file scrolled 12,451 logged flight hours, a number that made even seasoned pilots look twice. Combat deployments across multiple theaters, unlisted aircraft test programs, clearances above top secret, citations from Special Operations Wings, a Distinguished Flying Cross, a Silver Star, a Legion of Merit. The ribbons on that screen didn't match her flight suit. They matched legends. And then, the final line, Lead Design Engineer. X-7 Spectre Program. The drone she had just saved, the drone everyone in the room had barely understood. She hadn't just fixed it. She had built it. The override code she'd used wasn't a workaround. It was something she had written into the system herself, a line of defense so deep in the architecture it didn't show up in most manuals. She had spoken to the machine in its native language, not as a user. As its creator, Keen was silent. His mouth was slightly open, but no words came out. The room no longer looked at her the way it had an hour ago. Not with confusion. Not with dismissal. With awe. With something that looked a lot like reverence. Colonel Thorne stepped forward. Slowly. He stopped exactly 3 feet from her, measured by instinct and respect. Then he saluted, not a quick, routine gesture. This one was slow, precise, old-world formal, a salute reserved for heroism, for mourning, for truth. She returned it with a quiet nod. Thorne turned to the crowd. Rank means nothing without competence. He said, you saw bars and assumed value. You saw silence and assumed weakness. But authority is earned. It's proven. And tonight, it was demonstrated in the clearest way possible. Then he turned to Keen, his voice cool and steady. Let this be the moment you remember what real leadership looks like. Lieutenant Brandon Keen wasn't demoted. He wasn't written up or sent to disciplinary review. Colonel Thorne had something else in mind. Something keter. Something heavier. He handed Keen a blank legal pad and gave him an order. Write an apology. 1,000 words. By hand, not just to Chief Warrant Officer Ross, but to every warrant officer and senior non-commissioned officer on base. Then read it aloud. Not in a briefing room. Not in private, but at the next full base formation. It happened 2 days later. Just after 0700. The sun hadn't cleared the horizon yet. The tarmac still held the cool of night. Rows of uniforms stood in perfect alignment. Keen stepped up to the podium. his voice tight, his eyes locked somewhere just above the crowd. The swagger was gone. So was the smirk. What came out was simple, honest. He admitted what he had done, what he had failed to see, and who he had underestimated. His voice cracked near the end. Not from emotion, but from pressure. The weight of being wrong in front of everyone you once thought you outranked. Afterward, no one clapped. No one had to. That afternoon, Keene was seen in the motor pool, not barking orders, but crouched beside a master sergeant, asking about diesel diagnostics. Later in the week, he showed up in the comms shop, listening while a CW3 explained uplink redundancy protocols. He wasn't taking over. He was taking notes. The change didn't go unnoticed. Other lieutenants began to follow suit. Conversations started to shift. The invisible lines that once separated new officers from the tech veterans began to blur. Someone left a handwritten thank you on Ross's console. Someone else asked her to review their emergency checklists. She didn't say much. She never did. But she answered, and they listened. The base started to feel different, not in loud, obvious ways, but in the way people paused before speaking, in how they looked each other in the eye, in how they asked instead of assumed. Keene never spoke about that night again. He didn't need to. The lesson had sunk deep. Every question he asked, every manual he studied, every late shift spent shadowing someone more experienced, it all said the same thing. He was learning how to lead, not from books, not from bars on his collar, from the people he had once overlooked. In the weeks that followed, the emergency code sequence Chief Warrant Officer 5 Evelyn Ross had typed into that console was extracted, analyzed, and reviewed by some of the top systems engineers in the Department of Defense. What she had done wasn't just creative. It was groundbreaking. In less than 3 minutes, she had written a live override that bypassed multiple failed systems, manually redistributed fuel, and reprogrammed inertial guidance controls. It wasn't just a fix. It was a maneuver. And it worked. The Pentagon gave it a name. They called it the Ross Maneuver. It became standard protocol across every advanced unmanned aerial vehicle in the fleet. Not with ceremony or headlines, but in a quiet line of code buried deep in flight control logic, something future crews might never notice. But it was there, saving lives in silence. Just like she did, the place where the drone crash-landed an open stretch of marsh on the edge of the base was never formally marked, but it got a name anyway. Ross Point. Pilots passing overhead began a quiet tradition, just a subtle tip of their wings as they flew above the spot, a nod to the one who brought it down safely. Ross never made a speech, never gave an interview. The next morning, at precisely 7:15 a.m., she was back in the hangar, her coveralls stained with hydraulic fluid, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, explaining to a young airman why structural fatigue starts at the fastener and not the frame. She didn't mention the night before. When someone called her a hero, she only said she did what had to be done. That the system had worked the way it was supposed to. The story traveled, but not like gossip. It moved like a lesson, a piece of shared wisdom. It became part of in-processing. Every new officer assigned to the base sat through a briefing that included her name. They saw what she had done. They heard what she had endured. And they were told, plainly, that respect isn't measured by volume or rank. It's earned through skill, through calm in crisis, through work done when no one is watching. Ross's legacy wasn't made of awards. It wasn't carved into plaques. It lived in the quiet shift that spread across the base, in how lieutenants paused before speaking to techs, in how sergeants were listened to, in how competence began to matter more than collars. She didn't lead with noise. She led with action, and in doing so, she rewrote more than code. She rewrote culture.